Imagine standing on solid ground, looking out at a horizon that stretches farther than any eye can see. No ocean breaks the view. No distant continent hides beyond a curve of water. Just land. Endless, unbroken land reaching in every direction until it fades into haze and sky. This is not science fiction. This is not fantasy. This was Earth, our Earth, 250 million years ago. What if everything you thought you knew about geography was wrong? What if the map in your mind, the one with 7 continents separated by vast oceans, was just a recent arrangement? A temporary configuration in a planet that never stops moving? Because once, not so impossibly long ago in geological terms, all the land on Earth was pressed together into a single colossal mass. One supercontinent that dominated the surface of the planet. Its name was Pangaea, and standing on it would have been unlike anything you could experience today. The sheer scale would have overwhelmed you. Walk for a lifetime, and you still wouldn't reach the ocean from its interior. The climate would have shocked you, swinging between extremes that no modern continent experiences. And the creatures, the creatures that walked that ancient ground would have seemed pulled from nightmares and dreams alike. Some familiar in strange ways, others utterly alien to our modern eyes. But here's what truly staggers the mind. Pangaea shaped everything that came after. The dinosaurs that would rule for 165 million years? Their story began here. The first true mammals, ancestors to every warm-blooded creature alive today, including us. They emerged from Pangaea's crucible. Even the continents you see on maps today are simply the scattered fragments of this once unified world, still drifting, still carrying Pangaea's memory in their stone. Before we dive in, please consider subscribing and liking this video. Your support truly helps us continue this work. Thank you. Tonight, we're going back. Not to witness the formation of Earth itself, not to the age of the first life in ancient oceans, but to a moment when the planet had gathered all its land into one piece. A world that existed not in myth, but in stone, in fossil, in the very bedrock beneath your feet. We're going to walk across Pangaea. We're going to breathe its air, feel its winds, and understand how this single supercontinent rewrote the rules of life on Earth. The world beneath your feet is not permanent. It never has been. Right now, at this very moment, the continents are moving. North America drifts westward from Europe at roughly the speed your fingernails grow. Africa pushes slowly into Europe, raising the Alps millimeter by millimeter. The Atlantic Ocean widens while the Pacific shrinks. This isn't theory, it's measurable fact. GPS satellites track it in real time. But wind the clock backward, reverse that motion. Watch as the Atlantic narrows, as the continents creep toward each other, as millions of years compress into moments. Keep going. Past the age of human civilization, past the ice ages, past the extinction of the dinosaurs, past their rise, deeper and deeper into time, until suddenly, about 300 million years ago, the continents stop their retreat. They've touched, they've collided, they've welded themselves into one. This is Pangaea. In ancient Greek, the name means all earth, and never has a name been more fitting. Nearly every piece of continental crust that exists today was pressed together here. If you could have walked from what we now call New York, you could have continued eastward on foot, never seeing an ocean, all the way through what would become Scotland, then Norway, then across what would be Eastern Europe into what would become China. No Atlantic Ocean split your path. no North Sea, no Mediterranean, just continuous land stretching farther than ancient travelers could have imagined. Turn south, and you could have walked from South America directly into Africa without ever boarding a ship. Continue east, and you'd reach India, still locked against Antarctica and Australia. The entire connected mass sprawled across the planet like a colossal, irregular patch on the globe's surface. And around it, in every direction, stretched Panthalassa, the All Sea, a single global ocean so vast it makes the Pacific seem modest by comparison. Now, you might wonder, how do we know this? How can scientists reconstruct a world that vanished 200 million years before humans existed? The answer lies in evidence so overwhelming, so consistent across multiple fields of study, that denying it would be like denying that puzzle pieces once fit together. First, the continents themselves. Look at a map, really look at it. The eastern coastline of South America and the western coast of Africa fit together like torn pieces of paper. This isn't coincidence. When you align them properly, not just the coastlines, but the continental shelves, the underwater edges of the continents, they match almost perfectly. It's as if someone took a saw and cut through solid rock, then pulled the pieces apart. But it goes deeper. The rocks themselves tell the story. Ancient mountain ranges that end abruptly at one coastline pick up again on another continent across an ocean. The Appalachian Mountains of North America share the same rock types, the same ages, the same formation history as mountains in Scotland and Scandinavia. These weren't separate mountain ranges that coincidentally look similar. They were one range, built when the continents collided, then split when Pangaea broke apart. The fossils provide even more dramatic proof. Identical species, creatures that lived on land and could never have crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, appear on continents now separated by vast seas. Glossopteris, an ancient seed fern, left its fossils scattered across South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. The same plant on 5 continents. The only explanation that makes sense. Those continents were once connected. Then there's Mesosaurus, a small freshwater reptile from the early Permian period. Its fossils appear only in Brazil and South Africa, not in North America, not in Europe, not anywhere else. Just those 2 regions, which just happen to fit together perfectly when you reconstruct Pangaea. This wasn't a creature that could survive in salt water or cross oceans. It lived in coastal freshwater environments, and its limited range makes sense only if those 2 regions were once neighbors, separated by a river system, not an ocean. Even the scratches left by ancient glaciers tell the tale. During the late Carboniferous period, massive ice sheets covered parts of what would become South America, Africa, India, and Australia. The glaciers left distinctive marks in the bedrock, grooves carved by ice and rock, all pointing in directions that seem random when you look at modern maps. But reconstruct Pangaea, gather those continents together, and suddenly the pattern emerges. The glacial scratches all radiate outward from a single polar ice cap that once covered the southern portion of the supercontinent. The evidence isn't subtle. It's overwhelming. Pangaea wasn't a hypothesis that scientists wanted to believe. It was a conclusion forced upon them by data so consistent, so interwoven across geology, paleontology, and climatology that no other explanation survived scrutiny. But Pangaea didn't just appear overnight. The story of its formation stretches back even further into deep time, to an Earth that looked nothing like the world we inhabit. Understanding Pangaea means understanding the forces that built it. And those forces have been at work since the planet's crust first cooled and hardened billions of years ago. Beneath the surface we walk on, Earth is restless. The crust, that thin skin of solid rock, floats atop a layer called the mantle, where rock heated to near melting slowly churns and flows. This movement is imperceptibly gradual on human timescales, but over millions of years, it's relentless. The crust breaks into enormous plates, tectonic plates, that drift across the planet's surface like rafts on a slow-moving sea. These plates collide, pull apart, and grind past each other in an endless dance. Where they meet, mountains rise. Where they separate, oceans form. Where they slide laterally, earthquakes shatter the landscape. This is the engine of plate tectonics, and it's been running for most of Earth's history, reshaping continents, opening and closing oceans, building supercontinents, and then tearing them apart again. Pangaea wasn't the first supercontinent. It wasn't even the second. Before Pangaea, there was Pannotia, which existed around 600 million years ago. Before that, Rodinia, assembled about 1 billion years ago. Before that, others whose names are less certain, continental unions lost further in the depths of time. Earth has a rhythm, a cycle called the supercontinent cycle, where land masses gather together over hundreds of millions of years, persist for a time, then fragment and disperse, only to begin the slow journey of convergence again. The assembly of Pangaea began around 335 million years ago, in the late Carboniferous period. At that time, several large continental blocks drifted across the globe. Laurentia, which would become North America. Gondwana, a massive landmass incorporating future South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. Baltica, destined to become much of Europe. Siberia, smaller fragments scattered between them. These continents weren't stationary. They crept toward each other, carried by the slow convection currents in the mantle below. Oceans between them grew narrower year by year, century by century, millennium by millennium. The Rheic Ocean, which once separated Gondwana from Laurentia and Baltica, slowly closed like a vast wound healing. The ocean floor pulled into subduction zones, where one plate dove beneath another, disappeared into the Earth's interior. And when continents collide, the impact is anything but gentle. The crust crumples and folds. Rock that formed at sea level buckles upward into mountain ranges. The Appalachian Mountains, the Ural Mountains, parts of the mountains in North Africa, all rose during these collisions, testament to the incredible forces at play. Geologists call these collision zones sutures, the seams where separate continents welded together. You can still trace these sutures today in the rock record, ancient scars that mark where Pangaea was stitched into being. The final union happened around 270 million years ago in the Permian period. Gondwana, already massive, crashed into Laurussia, the combined landmass of Laurentia and Baltica. The impact raised the central Pangaean Mountains, a range that might have rivaled the modern Himalayas. To the east, Siberia rotated and collided, closing the Ural Seaway and raising the Ural Mountains. Smaller terrains, fragments of crust caught between the major players, were crushed and absorbed. And then it was done. All the land on Earth gathered into one colossal supercontinent. Pangaea stretched from pole to pole, though most of its mass clustered in the southern hemisphere and around the equator. Its shape was irregular, almost C-shaped, with a large embayment on its eastern side, called the Tethys Sea, a remnant of the ocean that once separated the continents. Standing at the center of Pangaea, you would have been farther from the ocean than any place on modern Earth. The interior of Asia, today's most landlocked region, would seem coastal by comparison. Thousands upon thousands of miles of land stretched in every direction. No sea breeze would reach you. No moisture-laden winds from the ocean would bring rain. You would stand in the heart of the largest desert the world has ever known. The climate of Pangaea was extreme. Not because the planet was hotter or colder overall, though temperatures did swing, but because of the supercontinent's sheer size. On modern Earth, oceans moderate climate. They absorb heat in summer and release it in winter, evening out temperature swings. Coastal regions experience milder weather than continental interiors. But Pangaea's interior was so far from any ocean that this moderating effect vanished. Summers in the deep interior were brutal. The sun beat down on land that stretched unbroken for thousands of miles, heating the surface to scorching temperatures. Without moisture, without clouds to provide shade, the ground baked. Temperatures likely soared far beyond what most of modern Earth experiences. Winter brought the opposite extreme. With no ocean to release stored heat, temperatures plummeted. The land cooled rapidly under clear skies, and brutal cold swept across the interior plains. The result was a climate of staggering extremes. Seasonal temperature swings that dwarfed anything modern continents experience. Monsoon patterns that brought months of torrential rain, followed by months of absolute drought. The interior deserts, starved of moisture, stretched endlessly. Red sandstones formed in these arid regions, their iron-rich composition staining them rust-colored. And we can still find these ancient desert deposits buried in the rock layers of modern continents. Near the coasts, conditions were different, but no less intense. The edges of Pangaea faced Panthalassa, and here, ocean winds brought moisture inland. Seasonal monsoons, driven by the heating and cooling of the massive continental interior, swept across the coastal regions with tremendous force. For part of the year, winds blew from the ocean inland, carrying heavy rains that fed vast forests and swamps. Then the winds reversed, pulling dry air from the interior back toward the sea, and the coastal regions dried. This wasn't gentle weather. This was climate on a continental scale, driven by the largest landmass Earth had seen in hundreds of millions of years. The monsoons that hit Pangaea's coasts might have been more powerful than any modern monsoon system. The droughts in its interior more severe than the harshest deserts today. Pangaea was a world of extremes, and everything that lived there had to adapt or perish. The forests that grew along Pangaea's coasts were unlike modern woodlands. These were ancient forests, built from plants that predated flowering trees. Seed ferns, their fronds spreading wide, dominated many regions. These weren't true ferns as we know them today, but rather an extinct group that reproduced through seeds, an evolutionary advancement over spore-based reproduction. They formed dense thickets in humid lowlands. Towering above them grew early conifers, ancestors of modern pines and firs. Their needle-like leaves adapted to conserve water and survive seasonal changes. Chordates, tall trees with strap-like leaves, stretched toward the sky in some forests. In swampy regions near rivers and coasts, Scale trees and giant horsetails created jungles that seemed almost alien. Plants whose modern descendants are small and humble, but which reached incredible sizes in Pangaea's oxygen-rich atmosphere. These forests were more than just plant communities. They were the lungs of Pangaea, pumping oxygen into the atmosphere through photosynthesis, pulling carbon dioxide out. The coal deposits we mine today, buried deep in modern continents, formed from these ancient forests. Layer upon layer of dead plant material accumulated in swamps was buried, compressed, and over millions of years transformed into the black rock that powered the Industrial Revolution. And moving through these forests was life. Strange life, wonderful life. Creatures that represented the cutting edge of evolution during the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras. The insects were perhaps the most immediately striking. During the Carboniferous period, leading up to Pangaea's full formation, oxygen levels in Earth's atmosphere were higher than today, possibly reaching 30% compared to our current 21%. This oxygen-rich air had a remarkable effect on arthropods, creatures that don't have lungs, but instead breathe through a network of tubes that passively absorb oxygen. More oxygen meant these systems worked more efficiently, and insects grew to astonishing sizes. Meganeura, a dragonfly relative, soared through the forests with a wingspan approaching 2.5 feet. Imagine something the size of a hawk, but with the body of a dragonfly, hunting smaller insects through the canopy. Arthropleura, a millipede-like creature, stretched over 6 feet long, the largest land invertebrate ever known. These weren't monsters from mythology. They were real animals, preserved in fossils, evidence of a world where the rules were different. As Pangaea fully formed and oxygen levels began to decline through the Permian period, these giants gradually disappeared. The insects that survived were smaller, more similar in size to modern species, but they remained abundant and diverse, filling every ecological niche from decomposers in the leaf litter to predators in the canopy. Among the vertebrates, amphibians still held considerable sway, especially in wetland environments. These weren't small frogs and salamanders like modern amphibians. Some Permian amphibians were massive, crocodile-like predators with broad skulls and powerful jaws. Archaeops, built like a tank with a head the size of a small dog, hunted in swamps and along riverbanks. But amphibians had a critical weakness. They still needed water to reproduce, their eggs vulnerable to desiccation. Reptiles changed that equation. The evolution of the amniotic egg, with its protective membranes and shell, freed vertebrates from dependence on water for reproduction. Reptiles could lay eggs on land, in hidden nests, protected from aquatic predators. This single innovation opened the entire interior of Pangaea to vertebrate colonization. Early reptiles were small and cautious, often no larger than modern lizards. They scurried through underbrush, hunting insects, avoiding the gaze of larger predators. But from these humble beginnings, reptiles diversified explosively. Some remained small and agile. Others grew larger, developing stronger jaws and more powerful limbs. Among the most successful were the synapsids, often called mammal-like reptiles, though that term is misleading. Synapsids weren't reptiles at all. They were a separate branch of amniotes that would eventually give rise to mammals. But during the Permian period, they were the dominant land animals on Pangaea. Early synapsids included pelycosaurs like Dimetrodon, instantly recognizable by the enormous sail on its back. That sail, supported by elongated vertebral spines and covered in skin, likely served to regulate body temperature, catching sunlight to warm up or dissipating heat through increased surface area. Dimetrodon was an apex predator in its ecosystem, hunting smaller vertebrates with powerful jaws lined with sharp, differentiated teeth. As the Permian progressed, more advanced synapsids called therapsids emerged. These creatures were extraordinary. They developed more upright limb postures, allowing for more efficient locomotion. Their skulls showed increasing complexity, with differentiated teeth for different functions: cutting, tearing, grinding. Some may have even had whiskers and primitive hair-like structures, though direct fossil evidence of such soft tissues is rare. Therapsids included massive herbivores like moschops, barrel-bodied plant-eaters that roamed in herds across Pangaea's plains. There were fierce predators like the gorgonopsids, saber-toothed hunters with skulls built for delivering devastating bites. And there were the cynodonts, relatively small therapsids that would survive the coming catastrophe and eventually evolve into true mammals. These animals spread across Pangaea because they could. With no ocean barriers, species could migrate from one end of the supercontinent to the other. Fossils of identical or closely related species appear on continents now separated by thousands of miles. Lystrosaurus, a pig-sized herbivorous therapsid, is found in South Africa, Antarctica, India, and China. The same animal on 4 continents, proof that they once formed a continuous habitat. But this golden age of the synapsids would end in fire and ice, in volcanic fury and atmospheric collapse, in the greatest mass extinction event in Earth's history. And understanding that catastrophe is crucial to understanding what Pangaea truly was. Not just a geographic configuration, but a crucible that tested life to its absolute limits. Around 252 million years ago, something went catastrophically wrong. Around 252 million years ago, something went catastrophically wrong. The Earth, which had been home to thriving ecosystems across Pangaea's vast expanse, suddenly turned hostile. What followed was the Permian-Triassic extinction event, known among paleontologists by a grimmer name, the Great Dying. It wasn't a single moment of destruction. It was a cascade of disasters that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, though in geological terms, that's the blink of an eye. The trigger lay deep within the Earth itself, in a region of modern-day Siberia where the crust was thinning, where heat from the mantle had been building pressure for millions of years. And then it erupted. Not a single volcano, but an entire volcanic province. Imagine an area larger than Western Europe, nearly 2 million square miles, where the ground split open and lava poured out. Not in explosive eruptions like Mount St. Helens or Krakatoa, but in massive flood basalt eruptions where molten rock simply welled up from deep fissures and spread across the landscape like water from a broken dam. These weren't brief eruptions. They continued for perhaps 1 million years, pulse after pulse of volcanism. The lava flows stacked up, layer upon layer, in some places reaching depths of over 2 miles. Today, we call this the Siberian Traps, and it represents one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history. But the lava itself, as destructive as it was locally, wasn't the main killer. It was what came out with the lava that poisoned Pangaea. Enormous quantities of carbon dioxide released from the magma and from carbonate rocks that the lava burned through. sulfur dioxide that reacted with water vapor to create sulfuric acid rain. Methane, possibly released from the ocean floor as warming waters destabilized frozen methane hydrates. Toxic gases that filled the atmosphere and changed its very chemistry. The carbon dioxide acted as a greenhouse gas, trapping heat. Global temperatures rose by perhaps 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, maybe more. For a planet that was already experiencing climate extremes due to Pangaea's configuration, this additional warming was catastrophic. The interior deserts expanded. The monsoons failed or became even more chaotic. Heat stress killed plants and animals that had evolved for different conditions. The oceans absorbed much of this carbon dioxide, which sounds beneficial until you understand the chemistry. When CO2 dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid. The oceans acidified, making it difficult for creatures with calcium carbonate shells to survive. Coral reefs, the rainforests of the ancient seas, collapsed. The acidification also disrupted the base of the marine food web. Worse still, the warming oceans lost their ability to hold dissolved oxygen. Warm water holds less gas than cold water, a simple fact of physics. As temperatures rose, oxygen levels in the ocean plummeted. Deep ocean currents that normally circulated oxygen-rich water from the poles to the tropics slowed or stopped. Vast regions of the ocean became anoxic, dead zones where nothing that needed oxygen could survive. On land, the effects were equally devastating. The forests withered. Without trees to anchor the soil and regulate the water cycle, erosion accelerated. Rivers carried massive sediment loads into the oceans, further disrupting marine ecosystems. The fossil record from this time shows a dramatic shift called a coal gap, a period where almost no coal formed because there weren't enough forests to create peat deposits. Animals died in staggering numbers. The great synapsids that had dominated Pangaea for tens of millions of years were decimated. Gorgonopsids, those saber-toothed predators, vanished entirely. Large herbivores died as their food sources disappeared. Even insects, which had survived previous extinction events relatively unscathed, suffered their only known mass extinction. Up to 70% of land vertebrate species disappeared. In the oceans, the death toll was even more severe. 96% of marine species went extinct. Entire groups of animals that had existed for hundreds of millions of years vanished forever. Trilobites, those iconic arthropods that had thrived since the Cambrian explosion over 300 million years earlier, finally went extinct. Vast reef systems collapsed. The ocean floor became a graveyard. Some estimates suggest that this extinction event killed 90 to 95% of all species on Earth. It was the closest that complex life has ever come to total annihilation. If you could have walked across Pangaea during the worst of it, you would have seen a world transformed into something resembling hell. Skies darkened by ash and acid rain, rivers running thick with sediment and devoid of fish, forests reduced to dead snags and barren ground. The sound of life, the buzz of insects, the calls of animals reduced to near silence. But life, as it always does, found a way. Not every species died. A few survived, clinging to existence in whatever refuges they could find. Small size helped. Animals that didn't need much food or water had better odds. Generalists that could eat a variety of foods survived better than specialists. And in some regions, perhaps isolated valleys or coastal areas where local conditions were less extreme, pockets of life endured. Among the survivors were a few small synapsids, ancestors of mammals. Cynodonts, like Thrinaxodon, no larger than a cat, survived by burrowing underground where temperatures were more stable. Some early archosaurs, the group that would give rise to dinosaurs and crocodiles, made it through. They were small, agile creatures, not yet the giants they would become. Certain reptiles adapted to dry conditions survived because Pangaea's interior had already been harsh, and they were pre-adapted to heat and drought. The extinction reset Pangaea's ecosystems. The world that emerged from the catastrophe was emptier, quieter, but also full of opportunity. With so many species gone, ecological niches stood vacant. Resources that had been competed over by dozens of species were now available to the handful that remained. Evolution, that relentless optimizer, began to fill those empty spaces. The recovery was slow. For millions of years after the extinction, Pangaea's ecosystems remained impoverished. Fossil records show low diversity, with a few species existing in large numbers rather than many species in smaller populations. The coal gap persisted into the early Triassic, evidence that forests took time to recover. Some regions may have remained nearly barren for 1 million years or more, but gradually life returned. Plants adapted to the new conditions spread across the landscape. Seed ferns and cycads, more drought-tolerant than many earlier plants, expanded their ranges. Early conifers diversified, evolving new species to fill different niches. These plants stabilized soils, began rebuilding carbon cycles, and provided food for herbivores. The herbivores that recovered were different from those that had dominated before. The large, barrel-bodied synapsids were mostly gone, replaced by new forms. Dicynodonts, like Lystrosaurus, became incredibly abundant in the early Triassic, so common that some fossil beds are almost entirely composed of their remains. These pig-sized herbivores had beaks for cropping vegetation and tusks, and they thrived in the harsh post-extinction world. Predators followed. With herbivores spreading across Pangaea, carnivores evolved to hunt them. Early archosaurs began to diversify, developing longer legs, more efficient locomotion, and more sophisticated hunting strategies. These creatures were the ancestors of dinosaurs, though they didn't look much like the giants we picture. They were relatively small, ranging from the size of a chicken to a large dog, but they were successful, and they were evolving rapidly. This was also when the first true dinosaurs appeared, emerging around 230 million years ago in the Middle Triassic. They were not the dominant animals at first, just another group of archosaurs trying to make a living in Pangaea's recovering ecosystems. Early dinosaurs like Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus were small, bipedal carnivores, quick and agile. They hunted smaller animals and probably scavenged when they could. What gave dinosaurs their eventual advantage? Multiple factors. They had efficient upright gaits, with legs positioned directly beneath their bodies, rather than sprawling to the sides like earlier reptiles. This made them more energy efficient over long distances, important in a world where resources might be scattered. They had efficient respiratory systems, possibly with air sacs like modern birds, allowing them to extract more oxygen from each breath. In a world where oxygen levels were still recovering from the extinction, this was a significant advantage. They also benefited from timing. The climate of the late Triassic was still harsh but stabilizing. Pangaea was beginning to split apart, though the process was in its early stages. New mountains were rising along rift zones. Volcanic activity created new habitats. Climate zones were shifting. In this dynamic world, adaptable, efficient animals had advantages, and dinosaurs were both. But dinosaurs weren't the only success story. The synapsids that survived evolved into new forms. Cynodonts, those small survivors of the extinction, diversified throughout the Triassic. They developed more complex teeth for processing food, more sophisticated jaw muscles, and increasingly mammal-like features. By the late Triassic, the first true mammals appeared, tiny creatures that lived in the shadows of larger animals but carried innovations that would serve them well in the future. These early mammals were small, probably nocturnal, with fur for insulation and possibly even rudimentary warm-bloodedness. They had specialized teeth that allowed them to eat insects, plants, or both. Their small size meant they could exploit food sources that larger animals ignored. They could burrow to escape heat or cold. And they were good at hiding, which was important in a world increasingly dominated by larger predators. Pangaea, during the Triassic period, was a world in transition. The climate remained extreme, but life was adapting. Forests grew denser, rivers filled with fish, insects recovered their diversity. New species evolved to fill the niches left empty by the extinction. And across this vast supercontinent, now beginning its long, slow process of breakup, the stage was being set for the age of dinosaurs. The Tethys Sea, that large embayment on Pangaea's eastern side, was expanding. Along Pangaea's margins, new rift valleys were forming, cracks in the crust where the supercontinent was beginning to pull apart. These rifts filled with water, creating long, narrow seas that would eventually widen into oceans. The Atlantic Ocean was beginning its birth, though it would take tens of millions of years to fully open. This rifting changed Pangaea's climate. The deep interior, once thousands of miles from any ocean, began to shrink as new seas cut into the landmass. Coastal areas expanded. Moisture from the ocean could penetrate farther inland. The extreme continental climate began to moderate, though it would take millions of years for the full effect to be felt. And through all of this, life spread. Species that evolved in one part of Pangaea could walk to another part, carrying their genes across thousands of miles. This is why dinosaur fossils from the Triassic period look similar whether found in Argentina, New Mexico, or Morocco. Pangaea was still sufficiently connected that animals could disperse across it, maintaining genetic contact between populations. But this wouldn't last forever. The forces pulling Pangaea apart were relentless, driven by heat from Earth's interior. As the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic period around 201 million years ago, another mass extinction struck, though smaller than the Permian-Triassic event. This extinction, possibly triggered by more volcanic eruptions, wiped out many of the large amphibians and archosaurs that weren't dinosaurs, giving dinosaurs the opening they needed. In the aftermath of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, dinosaurs exploded in diversity and size. Herbivorous sauropods began their march toward gigantism, evolving into creatures that would reach lengths of over 100 feet. Theropods, the carnivorous dinosaurs, diversified into hunters of all sizes, from chicken-sized Compsognathus to the massive Allosaurus. Ornithischian dinosaurs developed armor, horns, and eventually elaborate head crests. By the Middle Jurassic, around 170 million years ago, Pangaea was well into its breakup. The Atlantic Ocean, though still narrow, was unmistakably there. North America had separated from Africa. South America was beginning to pull away from Africa. The Tethys Sea was expanding, but some connections remained. North America was still linked to Europe. South America maintained a connection to Antarctica and Australia. Animals could still migrate between most of Pangaea's fragments, though the routes were becoming more restricted. This partial breakup created something new, the beginning of biogeographic separation. Species in one fragment of the former supercontinent began to evolve in isolation from those in other fragments. Over millions of years, this would lead to the evolution of distinct faunas on different continents. The dinosaurs of North America began to differ from those in South America. Asian dinosaurs developed their own characteristics, distinct from European forms. In the oceans surrounding the fragmenting supercontinent, marine life recovered and diversified. The seas of the Jurassic were full of life. Giant marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs hunted fish and squid. Early sharks evolved into forms that would be recognizable today. Ammonites, those coiled shell cephalopods, reached tremendous diversity. Coral reefs, absent since the Permian extinction, began to rebuild, though now dominated by scleractinian corals rather than the tabulate and rugose corals of the Paleozoic. The forests changed too. Gymnosperms, plants with naked seeds like conifers and cycads, still dominated, but they were diversifying. Ginkgos, now represented by a single species, were common and diverse during the Jurassic. Bennettitalas, extinct plants that resembled cycads but were unrelated, spread across many continents. These forests were lush and productive, feeding vast herds of herbivorous dinosaurs. And then, in the Middle Cretaceous period, around 130 million years ago, something revolutionary happened. Flowering plants, angiosperms, appeared. They started small and inconspicuous, but they possessed advantages that would allow them to spread rapidly. Flowers facilitated more efficient reproduction through insect pollination. Fruits helped disperse seeds. Rapid growth allowed them to colonize disturbed areas. By the late Cretaceous, angiosperms had transformed Earth's ecosystems. Flowering trees formed vast forests. Grasses evolved, eventually creating the first prairies and savannas, though true grasslands wouldn't dominate until after the dinosaurs were gone. The relationship between flowering plants and insects drove co-evolution, with both groups diversifying rapidly. Bees, butterflies, and many other modern insect groups evolved during this time. The fragmenting continents, once part of Pangaea, now hosted increasingly distinct ecosystems. North America developed its own characteristic dinosaur fauna, including tyrannosaurs and ceratopsians. South America had its abelisaurid theropods and unique sauropods. Africa and India, still connected in the south but isolated from other landmasses, evolved their own distinctive species. Each continent was becoming a separate evolutionary theatre. But for all these changes, for all the new species and ecosystems, the world still carried echoes of Pangaea. The mountain ranges built when the supercontinent formed still influenced climate and geography. The patterns of continental drift established during Pangaea's breakup still guide how continents move today. The evolutionary lineages that survived Pangaea's extinctions, whether dinosaurs, mammals, or flowering plants, all carried genetic legacies from that ancient supercontinent. The air above these fragmenting continents still circulated in patterns influenced by their positions. Ocean currents, increasingly complex as new seaways opened, redistributed heat around the globe in ways that affected every ecosystem. Climate zones shifted as continents drifted toward new latitudes. Species adapted or went extinct as their habitats changed beneath them. Standing on what had once been central Pangaea in the late Cretaceous around 70 million years ago, you would have seen a world recognizably different from the Permian. The climate was generally warmer and more humid. The supercontinent had split into distinct land masses separated by growing oceans. Dinosaurs had replaced synapsids as the dominant large land animals. Flowering plants had replaced gymnosperm-dominated forests in many regions. But look closer, and Pangaea's influence remained. The rocks beneath your feet were the same rocks that had been compressed and heated during Pangaea's formation. The fundamental patterns of evolution, the way species spread and diversified, still reflected the initial mixing and subsequent isolation that Pangaea's assembly and breakup had created. The very positions of the continents you could see on the horizon were determined by the rifts that had started forming in Pangaea hundreds of millions of years earlier. And then, 66 million years ago, another catastrophe struck. An asteroid 6 miles wide slammed into what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula with the energy of billions of nuclear weapons. The impact threw up vast clouds of debris that circled the globe. Wildfires ignited by ejected material burned across continents. Tsunamis hundreds of feet high swept across shallow seas. The sun was blocked for months or years, causing global temperatures to plummet. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event killed the non-avian dinosaurs. After 165 million years of dominance, they vanished in what was, geologically speaking, an instant. Large marine reptiles disappeared. Ammonites went extinct. Roughly 75% of species on Earth died. But the small mammals that had lived in Pangaea's shadow, that had evolved during the Triassic and survived in the margins throughout the Mesozoic, now had their opportunity. Without dinosaurs to compete with, mammals exploded in diversity. Within 10 million years, they had evolved from small, shrew-like creatures into forms ranging from tiny insectivores to massive herbivores. Bats took to the air, whales returned to the sea, primates evolved in tropical forests. The world these mammals inherited was a world still shaped by Pangaea's legacy. The continents continued their drift, moving into positions approaching those we see today. The Atlantic Ocean widened. India crashed into Asia, raising the Himalayas. Australia separated from Antarctica and drifted northward. South America remained isolated for millions of years, allowing unique mammals like sloths, armadillos, and marsupials to evolve there. These mammals, diversifying across the continents, carried in their DNA the story of Pangaea. Their fundamental body plan, inherited from the cynodonts that survived the Permian extinction, was refined during the Mesozoic, while dinosaurs dominated. Their ability to regulate body temperature, to give birth to live young or care for eggs, to develop complex teeth and sophisticated behaviors, all of these traits were forged during the long age of Pangaea and its aftermath. And among these mammals, in African forests around 7 million years ago, a lineage of primates began to walk upright. They descended from trees, adapted to changing environments, and over millions of years evolved larger brains and more complex behaviors. They developed tools, language, culture. They spread across Africa, then out into Eurasia, eventually reaching every continent except Antarctica. These creatures were humans, and we, like every other species on Earth, are products of the world Pangaea created. The continents we live on are fragments of that ancient supercontinent, still drifting, still carrying the story written in their rocks. The mountains we climb, the valleys we inhabit, the very ground beneath our cities. Much of it was shaped by forces set in motion during Pangaea's formation and breakup. The legacy of Pangaea isn't merely academic. It's not just a curiosity for geologists to puzzle over, or a chapter in Earth's deep history that has no relevance to the present. Pangaea's influence reaches into our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle, shaping the planet we inhabit today. Look at a map of fossil fuel deposits: coal, oil, natural gas. Their distributions seem random at first glance, but they tell the story of Pangaea. The great coal deposits of Appalachia formed from Carboniferous swamp forests when North America was colliding with other continents to form Pangaea. The coal fields of northern Europe formed in similar swamps on the other side of the same collision zone. Oil deposits in the Middle East formed in shallow tropical seas along Pangaea's Tethys coast. These resources that powered the Industrial Revolution and continue to drive modern civilization are the buried remnants of Pangaea's ecosystems. The mountain ranges we see today, many of them are Pangaea's bones. The Appalachians, running from Alabama to Newfoundland, were once part of a massive range that connected to the mountains of Morocco, Scotland, and Scandinavia. Time and erosion have worn them down from heights that might have rivaled the Himalayas to the gentler peaks we see today. But they remain testament to the colossal forces that built Pangaea. The Ural Mountains in Russia mark where Siberia collided with the western edge of Asia during Pangaea's formation. The Atlas Mountains of North Africa, the ancient Ouachita Mountains buried beneath the Gulf Coast sediments, the mountains of Tasmania and eastern Australia, all of these ranges tell the same story. Continents in collision, crust crumpling and rising, the assembly of a supercontinent. Even the patterns of earthquakes and volcanoes today reflect Pangaea's legacy. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, where new oceanic crust forms as the Atlantic widens, traces the line where Pangaea first began to split. The earthquakes that shake California mark where the Pacific Plate grinds past North America, a reminder that the same forces that assembled and broke apart Pangaea are still at work. The Ring of Fire around the Pacific Ocean, where volcanic eruptions and earthquakes are frequent, exists because oceanic plates formed after Pangaea's breakup are subducting beneath continental margins. The very distribution of species around the world carries Pangaea's fingerprints. Ratites, those large flightless birds like ostriches, emus, and rheas, are found on different continents in the southern hemisphere. They descended from a common ancestor that lived when those continents were still connected as part of Gondwana, the southern portion of Pangaea. When the continents split, their descendants went with them, evolving into distinct species, but retaining enough similarity to reveal their shared origin. Marsupials, those mammals that give birth to tiny, undeveloped young that complete their development in a pouch, tell a similar story. They evolved on the southern continents when they were connected. Today, most marsupials live in Australia, which drifted into isolation early, allowing them to diversify without competition from placental mammals. But marsupials also exist in South America, and fossils show they once lived in Antarctica, when it was warmer and connected to both. The distribution makes sense only when you understand Pangaea's breakup. Even plant distributions reflect ancient geography. Monkey puzzle trees, those distinctive conifers with spiraling branches covered in tough, overlapping leaves, are native to South America. But their fossil relatives are found in Australia and New Zealand, evidence of a time when these continents were neighbors on the southern reaches of Pangaea. The climate zones we experience today are products of continental positions established during and after Pangaea's breakup. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which circles Antarctica unimpeded by land, exists because Antarctica separated from South America and Australia, drifting to the South Pole. This current isolates Antarctica, keeping it cold and maintaining its vast ice sheets. Those ice sheets, in turn, influence global climate, sea levels, and ocean currents around the entire planet. The monsoons that bring seasonal rains to India and Southeast Asia are intensified by the Himalayas, mountains that formed when India, once part of Gondwana, crashed into Asia after a 50-million-year journey northward. The deserts of Australia exist partly because the continent drifted northward into latitudes dominated by high-pressure systems. The Atlantic Ocean that moderates Europe's climate exists because Pangaea split apart. Understanding Pangaea also helps us understand future changes. The continents haven't stopped moving. Africa is pushing into Europe, slowly closing the Mediterranean. The Atlantic continues to widen while the Pacific shrinks. In about 50 million years, the Mediterranean might close completely, raising new mountains. In 250 million years, the continents might collide again, forming a new supercontinent that some geologists have already named Pangaea Ultima. This isn't speculation. It's projection based on current plate motions and the physics of mantle convection. Just as Pangaea was not the first supercontinent, it won't be the last. The Earth has a rhythm, a supercontinent cycle that repeats roughly every 400 to 600 million years. Continents gather together, persist for perhaps 100 million years, then break apart and drift until they gather again in a new configuration. What will Pangaea Ultima look like? Computer models suggest the Atlantic might stop widening and begin to close, bringing the Americas back toward Europe and Africa. Or perhaps the Atlantic will continue opening while the Pacific closes completely, bringing Asia and the Americas together. Or the continents might gather around the equator or at one of the poles. The details are uncertain, but the general pattern is clear. The continents will collide again, and when they do, the effects will be as dramatic as Pangaea's assembly was. Enormous mountain ranges will rise. Ocean circulation patterns will change completely. Climate zones will shift. Species will face new challenges as their habitats transform. Some will adapt, some will migrate, and some will go extinct. And from the survivors, new forms of life will evolve, just as happened during Pangaea's time. This perspective, understanding Earth as a dynamic planet where nothing is permanent, changes how we see our world. The continents that seem so solid, so immovable, are actually sliding around the planet's surface at speeds we can measure. The mountains that seem eternal are temporary wrinkles in the crust, destined to be worn down and replaced by new ranges elsewhere. Even the oceans, those vast bodies of water that seem unchanging, are transient features, opening and closing over hundreds of millions of years. Life has adapted to this dynamic Earth. Every mass extinction, as terrible as it was for the species that died, created opportunities for survivors. The Permian-Triassic extinction that nearly ended complex life gave mammals and dinosaurs their chance. The Cretaceous extinction that killed the dinosaurs gave mammals their opportunity to dominate. Each extinction reset the board, allowing evolution to explore new possibilities. And through it all, the movement of continents shaped the stage on which evolution performed. Pangaea brought together species that had evolved in isolation, forcing them to compete and adapt. Its breakup isolated populations, allowing them to diverge into new species. The opening of oceans created barriers that shaped the distribution of life. The closing of oceans created land bridges that allowed species to spread into new territories. We humans are products of this process. Our primate ancestors evolved in African forests, environments shaped by the continent's position and climate. When Africa began to dry, forests gave way to savannas in many regions, and some primates adapted by walking upright and developing larger brains. Our ancestors spread out of Africa into Eurasia, following land routes available because of continental positions. Some reached Australia when sea levels dropped during ice ages, exposing land bridges. Others crossed into North America via the Bering Land Bridge and spread throughout the Americas. Our ability to inhabit almost every environment on Earth, from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra, from coastal lowlands to high mountains, reflects adaptations developed over millions of years as our ancestors spread across continents that were still moving, still changing. We are, quite literally, creatures of a dynamic planet, and we're still being shaped by it. The tectonic forces that built and broke apart Pangaea continue to influence human civilization. Earthquakes strike cities built on active faults. Volcanic eruptions reshape landscapes and affect climate. The resources we depend on, from fossil fuels to metallic ores, are distributed according to geological processes set in motion during Pangaea's time. But there's something else, something perhaps more profound. Understanding Pangaea gives us perspective. Our species has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Civilization emerged about 10,000 years ago. Industrial civilization is barely 300 years old. On the timescale of Pangaea, which existed for around 80 million years, human civilization hasn't even registered yet. This doesn't diminish human achievement. It contextualizes it. We are the only species we know of that can understand these vast timescales, that can reconstruct Pangaea from scattered clues in rocks and fossils, that can predict the planet's future based on its past. That's remarkable. But it also reminds us that the Earth existed long before us and will exist long after we're gone. The rock that formed from Pangaea's deserts, from its forests, from sediments laid down in its rivers and oceans. That rock contains a record more complete and accurate than any human history. It tells us that change is constant, that nothing remains the same, and that adaptability is the key to survival. Standing on any continent today, you're standing on a piece of Pangaea. The ground beneath your feet once was connected to lands now thousands of miles away. The mountains you see on the horizon might have been built when those lands collided. The fossils buried in local rocks might be related to fossils found on completely different continents. You are, quite literally, standing on ancient history. And that history is still being written. The continents are still moving. New mountains are rising while old ones erode. Ocean basins open and close. Species evolve, adapt, spread, and sometimes go extinct. The story that began with the first solid crust on a molten planet continues today and will continue for billions of years into the future, until the sun itself runs out of fuel and swells to consume the inner planets. But for now, we exist in a brief moment of that vast story. A moment shaped profoundly by Pangaea, by its assembly and breakup, by the extinctions and evolutionary explosions it triggered, by the continental positions it established and the ocean basins it created. We are Pangaea's children, descendants of the small creatures that survived its catastrophes and thrived in the world it created. Every breath you take contains oxygen produced by photosynthesis, a process refined over hundreds of millions of years by plants whose ancestors grew in Pangaea's forests. Every step you take is on land shaped by tectonic forces that built and broke that supercontinent. Every time you look at a map, you're seeing the result of Pangaea's breakup, a process still ongoing, still changing the world. The story of Pangaea is not a story about the past. It's a story about how the past created the present and will shape the future. It's a story about a planet that's alive in the geological sense, constantly changing, never still. It's a story about life's resilience, its ability to survive catastrophes and emerge in new forms. And it's a story about perspective, about understanding our place in vast sweeps of time that dwarf human experience. When you understand Pangaea, you understand that the world you inhabit is temporary. The continents will move, the climate will change, species will evolve. Hundreds of millions of years from now, Earth will be as different from today as today is from Pangaea. And somewhere in that future, perhaps intelligent beings will stand on whatever continents exist then and reconstruct our time, understanding how their world came from ours, just as we understand how our world came from Pangaea. This is the great gift of geology and paleontology. They allow us to see across time, to understand that the world is far older, far stranger, and far more dynamic than our everyday experience suggests. To know that solid ground is actually in motion, that mountains rise and fall, that continents dance slowly across the globe in an endless cycle of assembly and breakup. Pangaea was real as the ground beneath your feet, because it is the ground beneath your feet. Its mountains, eroded but still standing, frame your horizons. Its rocks, transformed but still present, form the foundations of your cities. Its fossils, scattered across continents, tell its story to anyone willing to read them. And its legacy, written in continental positions, ocean currents, climate zones, and the distribution of life, shapes every aspect of our modern world. So the next time you look at a map, really look at it. See the Atlantic Ocean not as a permanent feature, but as a growing rift, an ocean still being born from Pangaea's breakup. See South America and Africa not as eternally separate continents, but as neighbors temporarily apart, carrying matching coastlines and matching fossils that tell of a time when they touched. See Antarctica not as a frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world, but as a continent that was once part of a greater whole, a land that hosted forests and dinosaurs when it was connected to warmer regions. Understand that the earth beneath your feet is in motion. Slow motion, imperceptible in a human lifetime, but motion nonetheless. The continent you're on is drifting, carrying you with it at perhaps an inch or two per year. In 1,000,000 years, it will be miles from where it is now. In 100 million years, it might be part of a new supercontinent. assembled from the scattered fragments of Pangaea. And perhaps, most importantly, understand that you are part of this story. Your body is built from elements forged in stars and recycled through the planet for billions of years. Your DNA carries information passed down from organisms that lived on Pangaea, that survived its extinctions, that adapted to its extremes. You are a temporary arrangement of matter that was old when Pangaea formed and will persist long after you're gone, reorganized into new forms, new creatures, new chapters of Earth's endless story. Pangaea teaches us humility and wonder in equal measure. Humility because it shows us how brief and small we are against the vast canvas of geological time. Wonder because we, tiny creatures living for mere decades on a planet billions of years old, can understand that canvas. We can reconstruct vanished worlds from fragments of evidence. We can predict future worlds based on present processes. We can hold in our minds time spans that dwarf our existence. This is what Pangaea was, a supercontinent that united the world's land into one colossal mass, that created climates of unprecedented extremes, that tested life to its limits, and forged innovations that persist today. It was a world of towering forests and endless deserts, of catastrophic extinctions and explosive evolutionary radiations, of mountains that touched the sky and rivers that flowed for thousands of miles without meeting an ocean. It was a world that seems alien and distant, yet it's closer than you think. Every continent you see was part of it. Every mountain range that predates the breakup was built by it. Every species that survived its extinctions carries its legacy in their genes. Even the air you breathe and the water you drink have been recycled through Pangaea's forests, oceans, and atmosphere. We are living in Pangaea's world. We always will be. Not because it still exists in its original form, but because its influence pervades everything about our planet. It shaped the stage on which evolution performed, creating the continents, climate zones, and ocean basins that determine where species can live and how they adapt. It tested life in ways that prepared survivors for every subsequent challenge. And it demonstrated the fundamental truth about Earth. Nothing is permanent, everything changes, and adaptation is survival. The supercontinent cycle will continue. Millions of years from now, long after humanity is gone, the continents will collide again. A new Pangaea will form, not identical to the original, but similar in concept. One land, united briefly against the endless ocean before tectonic forces tear it apart once more. And on that future supercontinent, if any complex life survives the changes leading to its formation, evolution will write new chapters of adaptation and survival. But that's the future. For now, we live in the age of fragments, the time between supercontinents when the land is scattered across the globe. It's a brief moment in geological terms, a period of continental separation that will last perhaps another 200 million years before the cycle completes again. And in that brief moment, we exist, creatures capable of understanding where we came from and where we're going, standing on ground that was once part of something larger and will be again. So when you walk on Earth, know that you walk on Pangaea. When you see mountains, understand they might be Pangaea's mountains, worn by time but still standing. When you find fossils, recognize them as Pangaea's creatures, preserved in stone, waiting to tell their story. And when you think about the future, remember that the forces that built and broke Pangaea are still at work, still changing the world, still writing Earth's never-ending story in stone and time. This is what Earth was like during Pangaea. A single world, united briefly in geological time, host to life that survived unimaginable catastrophes and evolved into forms that still walk the planet today. A world that seems distant but remains present in every rock, every mountain, every ocean basin, and every living thing. A world that teaches us that change is inevitable, that nothing remains the same, and that adaptation and resilience are the keys to survival in a universe that never stands still. The story of Pangaea is ultimately our story. It's the story of where we came from, why the world looks the way it does, and where it's all heading. It's a story written in stone, told through fossils, and continued in the slow, relentless drift of continents. And it's a story that reminds us that Earth is not a static stage for life's drama, but an active participant, constantly changing, endlessly dynamic, forever in motion. We are Pangaea's legacy. And understanding that legacy helps us understand ourselves, our world, and our place in the vast sweep of time that is Earth's history. From a single supercontinent to scattered fragments, from catastrophic extinctions to explosive diversifications, from ancient forests buried as coal to modern ecosystems shaped by continental drift, Pangaea's influence touches everything. And so we end where we began, standing on ground that was once part of something larger, looking at a world shaped by forces set in motion hundreds of millions of years ago, understanding that we are brief visitors in a story that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone. But in our brief moment, we have the privilege of understanding, of knowing where we came from, of recognizing Pangaea's echo in the world around us, and of appreciating the vast, deep history written in the very ground beneath our feet.